Horus, also called Horus Lupercal, or more simply the Lupercal during his lifetime by the Astartes of his Lunar Wolves Legion, was one of the 20 genetically engineered primarchs created by the Emperor of Mankind from the foundation of his own DNA before the start of the Great Crusade to lead the armies of the newborn Imperium of Man. Horus was the Primarch and master of the 16th Legion of Space Marines, the Lunar Wolves, later renamed by him to the Sons of Horus. He was also the first Imperial Warmaster, the most favoured son of the Emperor, and ultimately the greatest traitor in the history of mankind. Horus's homeworld was the hive world of Chthoniya, which lay only a few light years from Terra. Horus was thus the first Primarch to be rediscovered by the Emperor after the Great Crusade began in the late 30th millennium. Horus was responsible for unleashing the horrific civil war known as the Horus Heresy upon the Imperium of Man in the early 31st millennium, which killed billions of people in pursuit of his mad ambition to overthrow the Emperor of Mankind and replace him as the ruler of the human race. While Horus ultimately lost his bid for power and was slain by the father he had once so loved during the Siege of Terra, his actions damaged the Imperium of Man beyond repair and inaugurated the current age of the Imperium, when mankind is beset by countless horrific dangers to its existence, and the Imperium itself has become a stagnant, repressive, and dehumanizing galactic presence. Horus's early life. Created as a genetically engineered organism by the Emperor in one of the Imperial gene laboratories under the Himalaysian mountains in Terra in the late 30th millennium, Horus, along with his brother Primarchs, were scattered across the Milky Way galaxy through the warp by the machinations of the ruinous powers of chaos. This is said to be when the Dark Gods first planted the seeds of heresy into the infant Primarch, whispering darkly into his soul and tempting him to their cause. The capsule carrying the still gestating Horus came to rest on the mining world of Chthoniya, the primary planet of a star system within a reasonable slower-than-light distance of Terra. Whereas the early history of many Primarchs is extensively, if unevenly, documented, the same cannot be said of Horus. Contradiction and omission tarnishes all accounts of Horus's formative years. It is clear that the Emperor did not find Horus, and also that he took command of the 16th Legion early in the Great Crusade. Beyond these manifest facts, agreement between the early Imperial sources is decidedly lacking, some even placing Horus on Chthoniya as a foundling. Like many of his superhuman brethren, these sources say that the young Primarch thrived on Chthoniya's harsh environment, learning his first lessons in war and killing from Chthoniya's tech barbarian kill gangs. The world of Chthoniya had been settled in the very earliest days of humanity's exploration of the stars, its rich natural resources ruthlessly exploited until they were all but played out. Thus, Horus grew to maturity amongst the anarchic gangers that populated the post-industrial nightmare of a world honeycombed with long-extinct mines and dominated by decaying hive cities. Though Horus had not been raised during his formative years on Chthoniya, uncommonly for a Primarch he had not matured on the cradle world of his legion, he spoke the harsh language known as Chthonic fluently. In fact, he spoke it with the particularly hard palatal edge and rough vowels of a Western hemispheric ganger, the commonest and roughest of Chthoniya's feral castes. Horus never did anything by accident, and there were those who believed that the Warmaster's rough Chthonic accent was a deliberate affectation so that he would seem, to the Astartes of the 16th Legion, as honest and low-born as any of them. It was from the hyper-violent gang scum of Chthoniya that many of the earliest inductees into the Space Marine legions were recruited, and it was there that the Emperor had found the first of his lost sons. Another source claims that Horus returned to Terra himself. It is said that Horus grew at the Emperor's side, learning from his father even as they took back the Sol System and forged the alliances between the techno-barbarian nations of Terra and the Mechanicum of Mars that created the early Imperium of Man. Other highly creditable claims state that the Emperor found Horus, the first of his lost sons, but neither source specifies where or the location of this finding. Surrounded in a millennia of myths and allegory, the truth of Horus's origins will more than likely never be known. As a result, Horus was for many standard years the Emperor's only son, and there was a great affinity between them. The Emperor spent much time with his protege, teaching and encouraging him. Horus was soon replaced in command of the 16th Legion, which had already come to be known as the Lunar Wolves, thousands of Astartes created from his own genetic code. With these transhuman warriors to lead, Horus accompanied the Emperor and his Principia Imperialis fleet for the first 30 standard years of the Great Crusade that had begun in CA 798.M30, and together they forged the initial interstellar expansion of the young Imperium of Man. The Great Crusade. Chthoniya, relatively close to Terra in the Void, and with whom some minor intermittent contact had been maintained even through the Age of Strife, had its murderous and strife-torn population marked by one of the first expeditionary fleets of the Great Crusade to leave the Sol system. With its resources stripped, it had little strategic worth, and its people were judged largely beyond illumination, but the fledgling Imperium needed teeth as well as ideals, and that necessity saved Chthoniya. Its youth was harvested in their tens of thousands, first as impressed troopers for the Crusade armies, and then the finest specimens were taken for the Legion. On Lunar, these chosen sons of Chthoniya were reborn as warriors of the 16th Legion. With these new recruits came a further accolade. The Emperor, in honour of their new birthplace, the ruthless propensities of the Chthonians and the victories of the past won by the Legion's original Terran Astartes, such as the first pacification of Lunar, gave the 16th Legion a name to strike fear into its enemies. As they scattered to spill blood amongst unclaimed stars, their enemies would know them as the Lunar Wolves. For 30 standard years, the Emperor and Horus fought the opening campaigns of the Great Crusade side by side, the Primarch leading at the front of his sire. When at length the Emperor detected another of the Primarchs and departed to locate him, Horus was left at the head of his master's hosts, the Principia Imperialis, entrusted with the command of the conquering armies. Horus was well suited to the task, and the lessons he had learned in the previous 3 solar decades served him well. As one by one the other Primarchs were united with their gene father and their brothers, Horus came increasingly to be regarded as the greatest of their number, the first amongst equals. When the second Primarch was found, Horus, while happy that he would soon meet one of his brothers, swore to himself that he would always remain the Emperor's favoured child. The Lunar Wolves waged war for 200 years, pushing back the darkness with fire and blood. Their victories were manifold, and Horus's generalship was legend, and so it was that the respect of their brother legions rose to almost unrivaled heights. While many of his brothers and the Space Marine legions created in their genetic image were gifted in specific fields of military science, Horus was a natural leader. His greatest genius, his ability to meld seemingly divergent allies into a coherent whole. This skill was not only of use on the battlefield, for it carried over into contacts with the peoples the Great Crusade met. It was Horus's way to treat the populations of newly contacted worlds according to the cultural traditions of each, and this highly successful doctrine was repeated in each of the Imperial expeditionary fleets. Horus believed that to do so would lessen the hostile reaction of opponents who wished to parley. Tragically, this tendency might have also been one of the causes of the Primarch's fall. As the Great Crusade pushed outward, and more Primarchs were discovered, the Emperor's time became divided, pulled in more and more directions. Horus was often placed in overall strategic command of the Great Crusade, a position in which he proved his skill as a leader time and time again. He quickly won the approval and support of the other Space Marine legions, along with their leaders. One of the skills that made Horus such a great leader was that he possessed an innate understanding of human psychology. He was able to read people in such a way that he could choose to promote their strengths or exploit their weaknesses. This allowed him to find a non-military solution in several campaigns, as he used his sheer inhuman charisma and diplomatic negotiation skills combined with the ever-present threat of the Space Marine Legion's unstoppable force to bring other human-settled worlds into Imperial compliance without bloodshed. His understanding of the human mind allowed Horus to bring out the best within his fellow Primarchs, which allowed him to deploy the various Astartes legions into the battlefield roles to which they were best suited. He quickly learned of the skill displayed by the White Scars and Night Lords in deploying for rapid strikes, while the Imperial Fists and Iron Warriors were always placed at the forefront of planetary sieges. Horus was said to wield the Space Marine Legions, and later the merely human soldiers of the Imperial Army, as a lesser general would position individual squads to perform to their advantages. He was also responsible for promoting competitive rivalries between certain Space Marine legions in the desire to spur these Astartes onto greater heights, but these rivalries would eventually transform into outright hatred when the Great Crusade took a turn for the worse. Shortly after the Lunar Wolves Legion and their allies declared victory in the Great Crusade against the mightiest Orc Empire faced by the Imperium until the 41st millennium, the Emperor offered Horus the honour of renaming his legions the Sons of Horus in honour of himself and to show him his preeminent place among the other Primarchs. Horus refused this honour, characteristically not wishing to be set above his brothers, but was promoted to the newly created rank of Imperial Warmaster, serving as the new supreme commander of the Imperium's millions-strong armies. The Emperor then left the Crusade in Horus's capable hands and returned to Terra to pursue the secret Imperial Webway project that he hoped would draw the newborn Imperium together in unbreakable bonds. Despite the majestic rank and unparalleled authority bestowed on him, it was said that Horus was not content. The wording of the Emperor's declaration claiming the glory of Horus's victories as entirely his own chafed. Although this was the usual rhetoric for such imperial announcements, Horus saw that while the Emperor remained behind in the Imperial Palace on Terra for reasons that he would not share even with his sons, Horus would be out in the field of battle, winning the Emperor's Imperium for him. It seemed that a deep-rooted resentment and jealousy had begun to simmer in the corners of the Warmaster's mind. As the Imperial Warmaster, Horus took over command of the Great Crusade and accepted his new duties with earnest dedication. However, there was much dissension in the ranks of the Primarchs and other parties in the Imperium over the Emperor's decision to withdraw from the campaign and return to Terra, as well as to recognise the political administration of the Imperium under the control of a Council of Terra headed by his regent, Malcador the Sigillite. Only a handful of the Primarchs, amongst them a scheming Lorgar, remained steadfast beside the Warmaster during this period of conflict. Horus also disagreed with many of the decrees passed by the newly established Council of Terra, a ruling body of imperial nobles and bureaucrats, which were intended to shift the burden of taxation and administration onto the newly conquered imperial compliant worlds. Even worse, Horus came to believe in his heart that he was failing his father, and was deeply wounded that the Emperor had revealed to none of the Primarchs, not even his most favoured son, why he had secluded himself upon Terra and the truth behind his secret Imperial Webway project. These seeds of bitterness, resentment, and frustration grew, and would soon bear deadly fruit. It was around this time that Horus, upon the advice and counsel of his greatest friend among his fellow Primarchs, Sanguinius of the Blood Angels, decided to change the name of the Lunar Wolves to the Sons of Horus after all. Sanguinius had argued that the Emperor had suggested the honour precisely to show his great confidence in Horus. Bearing such a designation would show the other Primarchs that Horus had earned his right to command them through the Emperor's trust in his judgment and leadership. First Chaplain Erebus of the Worldbearers, the 17th Space Marine Legion that was secretly in league with the forces of Chaos, since they had been humiliated by the Emperor for their violations of the Imperial truth on the world of Kur over 40 Terran years before the start of the Horus Heresy, became a very close confidant and advisor of Horus. The Worldbearers, who originally had worshipped the Emperor as a god and whose Primarch Lorgar had penned the Lectitio Divinitatis before he turned against his father following the events on Kerr, had been brutally reprimanded for their constant erection of temples and shrines dedicated to the worship of the God Emperor on newly conquered worlds. This was a policy that had directly violated the Emperor's atheistic imperial truth and had slowed the 17th Legion's progress in the Great Crusade to a crawl. In the wake of his humiliation and the reprimand against his legion on Kerr, Lorgar had sought to discover whether there truly were divinities worth of human worship during the quest that came to be known as the Pilgrimage of Lorgar. During this journey, Lorgar entered the Eye of Terror and came face to face with the power of Chaos, a force he believed was truly divine and worthy of his service and the worship of all mankind. He brought this faith to his legion, and soon all the Astartes of the Worldbearers believed that the Chaos Gods were more worthy of their loyalty and worship than the Emperor, who had proved himself to be a false god. With the guidance of the ruinous powers, Lorgar and the Worldbearers hatched their secret plans over the course of the next 4 solar decades to convert humanity to the service of the Dark Gods, starting with Horus. After Lorgar placed his agent near Horus, Erebus slowly managed to twist the thinking of Horus against the Emperor and turn half of the Mournival, the Warmaster's most trusted advisors within the 16th Legion, towards the same path of treachery by exploiting their intense loyalty to the Primarch over that for their far more distant Emperor. This plot reached its climax on the moon of the feral world of Davin, where Horus was wounded during a struggle against Yugen Temba, the former planetary governor of Davin, who had rebelled against the Imperium following his corruption by Chaos. An ancient Xenos artifact blade, sacred to Nurgle, known as the Kinebrach Anathame, had been stolen by Erebus from the museum of an advanced human civilization called the Interrex during the Sons of Horus' brief sojourn on their world of Zenobia, and had been given by him to Temba. Temba had become the mutated servant of Nurgle, the chaos god of disease and decay, and managed to seriously wound the Warmaster with the corrupted blade. The apothecaries of the 16th Legion proved incapable of healing the Warmaster's wounds despite every form of advanced medical technology at their disposal, until it seemed that Horus would surely die. Erebus then convinced the officers of the Sons of Horus' warrior lodge to allow him to take the Warmaster to a secret sect on Davin's moon, and use sorcery at this temple of the Serpent Lodge in order to treat Horus. The creation of a warrior lodge within the Lunar Wolves and many other Space Marine legions based on the lodges used by the Savage Warriors of Davin had been another of Lorgar and Erebus' plays to infiltrate and corrupt the Astartes into turning against the Emperor across the decades. However, not all Astartes of the legions joined the lodges, as many saw them as a direct violation of the Emperor's desires that all Space Marines dedicate themselves to truth and openness with others among themselves. He also presciently believed that secret cabals created within military organizations almost always led eventually to conspiracies and betrayal. The lodges would prove to be the primary purveyors of corruption in these legions, which turned traitor in the days immediately preceding the start of the Horus Heresy. Those Astartes within those legions which lodges held themselves aloof from those secret organizations were marked as Imperial loyalists, who would later be betrayed by Istvan III. The Serpent Lodge on Davin was in truth a chaos cult, and using sorcery, which was outlawed by the Emperor, the cultists managed to warp the mind of the Warmaster against the Emperor by playing on the seed of jealousy and resentment that he felt for his father after the Emperor had left the Great Crusade behind to return to Terra. During the dark rituals that followed within the temple, Horus's spirit was transferred from his body into the Immaterium. There, he bore witness to a nightmare vision of the future. He saw the Imperium of Man as a repressive, violent theocracy, where the Emperor and several of his primarchs, but not Horus, were worshipped as gods by the masses. While this vision of the imperial future granted by the Chaos Gods was a true one, it was ironically an outcome largely created by the Warmaster's own actions. The Dark Gods portrayed themselves as victims of the Emperor's psychic might, and claimed that they had no real interest in the happenings of the material world. Magnus the Red, the sorcerous Primarch of the Thousand Suns Legion, had also travelled into the warp via sorcery to try and stop Horus from turning to chaos. Magnus explained that the Warmaster's vision was only one among many possible futures, but one that Horus alone could prevent. But Horus, already jealous and resentful of the Emperor, proved all too receptive to the ruinous power's false vision. The Chaos God's pact with Horus was simple: give us the Emperor and we will give you the galaxy. Driven by his jealousy, desire for power, and anger at what he saw as his father's abandonment of him, Horus accepted the ruinous power's offer. They healed his grievous wound and filled him with the powers of the warp. Renouncing his oath to the Emperor, Horus led his legion into worship of the myriad Chaos Gods in the form of Chaos Undivided. He then sought to turn many of his fellow Primarchs to the service of Chaos, and succeeded with Angron of the World Eaters, Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, and Mortarion of the Death Guard, who were the first of many to follow, along with many regiments of the Imperial Army and several Titan legions of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the Thousand Suns Legion, foresaw Horus's actions through his legion's own use of psychic sorcery that had been forbidden several years earlier at the Council of Nicaea. Magnus then attempted to forewarn the Emperor of the impending betrayal of his favourite son. However, knowing that he would have to find a means of quickly warning the Emperor, Magnus used sorcery to send his message by taking on astral form in the warp. This message ultimately penetrated the potent psychic defences in the Imperial Palace on Terra, shattering all the psychic wards the Emperor had placed on the palace, including those within his secret project in the Imperial Dungeons, where he was proceeding with the creation of the human extension into the webway. Refusing to believe that Horus, his most beloved and trusted son, would actually betray him, the Emperor instead mistakenly perceived the traitor to the Imperium to be Magnus and his 1,000 sons, who had long suffered a near-debilitating run of mutations known as the Flesh Change, because of the instability of Magnus's own genome, and were known to have practiced the sorcery that had been expressly outlawed in the Imperium. The Emperor ordered the Primarch Leman Russ, Magnus's greatest rival, to mobilise his Space Wolves Legion and the witch hunters known as the Sisters of Silence, and take Magnus into custody to be returned to Terra to stand trial for violating the Council of Nicaea's prohibitions against the use of psychic powers within the Imperium. While en route to the 1,000 Suns Legion's homeworld on Prospero, Horus convinced Russ, who had always been repelled and horrified by Magnus's reliance on psychic powers, to launch a full assault on Prospero instead, even though Magnus had been entirely willing to face the Emperor's judgment once he realised he was being manipulated by the entities that called the Immaterium home. In this way, Horus was successful in convincing Russ to become Magnus' executioner instead of his gaoler. The burning of Prospero was the tragic result. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please give it a like and subscribe, because I'm going to be covering more and more and more Warhammer 40k lore. My name is George, this is Jam Punch, and I will see you next time.